All right, so my presentation is titled Military Connected Interpersonal Violence Survivors Living with Disabilities. This is myself and my service dog, Daisy. She is a PTSD anxiety service dog. She looks really serious there and she does a lot of amazing things. You might hear her snoring in the background, but a little bit about myself is I am a Navy veteran and a service disabled veteran and a licensed master social worker, a violent survivor, and an advocate. And through my experience, which I'll share a little bit of my story, but through my experience, I have not just experienced what it's like to have trauma or assaults, but also the disabilities that can result from trauma. And experiencing that has led me to being an advocate for survivors living with disabilities. And this is not necessarily just physical disabilities, which is something that's more common or that's more familiar with others because you can see them, but also disabilities that you can't see. A lot of those that come with trauma, such as mental health disabilities, including PTSD, anxiety, depression, so forth and so on. I want to know who you are. So I've looked at the registration, but I want to know who you are. If you can put in the chat box, are you a veteran? Or if you are a few of these, maybe you may be a veteran, but also a government civilian, that's fine. Okay, that's what I thought. Oh, there we go. There's the poll. There's also a poll here. You can answer there as well. Thank you. We have a pretty good mix, it looks like. Awesome. Okay. I'll go ahead and end the poll. So I love that we do have a good mix of those that are here and present in the audience. I will say, as I stated in Dr. Poe's presentation as well, is that not all our experiences are the same. Again, a huge advocate for mental health awareness, for disabilities, survivors living with disabilities, and every experience is different. And trauma that comes with interpersonal violence doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to result in a disability. So I think that's important, which will lead me into my disclaimers. The first disclaimer. Oh, I see. Constance, I see that you have your hand raised. If you want to put a question in the Q&A or if you'd like to put it in the chat box. My first disclaimer is that we are going to be talking about interpersonal violence prevention, domestic violence, sexual assault, sexual harassment, and we'll also be talking about disabilities that can result from those experiences. But there are limitations. When it comes to the progress that the military, the DoD has made and the VA have made, it is there. We see the progress. However, there is limited data on the different diagnoses or the treatments or the prevalence of disabilities that are developed due to a becoming a survivor of violence, becoming a victim of sexual assault, domestic violence, sexual harassment, stalking. We have the data showing the estimates, like Dr. Poe talked about some of those. We have the data showing of the reports, but there's not a lot of research at this point of knowing how many of those result in a disability, and not just a disability, but also a disability that can significantly impact the survivor's life in different ways. So keep that in mind. Another disclaimer is gender identity and sexual orientation. I like to say this in my presentations because we recognize different orientations and genders. I am an ally. However, the DoD and the Department of Veterans Affairs, even though they prohibit discrimination on gender identity, there is still the male and female biological sex identification. And so when you're reading the stats or you're hearing me talk, I'm making sure that I'm in line with that. So just keep that in mind as well. All right, so I talked a little bit about what we're going to be reviewing here today. And the first is disability defined and what that is, the barriers to inclusion, the prevalence in the military environment, and some best practices. I always like to leave people with a few tips to take away. The first is disabilities. So an individual with a disability. This definition I like to read word for word because it does come from the American with Disabilities Act, and it defines an individual with a disability as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. A person who has a history or record of such an impairment, or a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. And I think that last one is very key there because a lot of times you may see someone, a common one is a skin condition or something, again, that the human eye can see. And somebody may think, oh, wow, that must be really hard for that person, or that must make that person's life very difficult to have that kind of skin diagnosis or that kind of disability or illness. Even if it does not significantly impact or substantially limit one or more of their major life activities, they're still protected under the ADA because they're being perceived by others as having that impairment and it doing so. So, some commonly used categories of disabilities is physical, developmental, behavioral or emotional, and then sensory impaired disorders. Question for you. This should be another poll popping up here in a second. When someone is living with a disability that is not visible to another person, what's the most appropriate term to describe this? Invisible, non-visible, or hidden? What do you think? A couple more moments. I see some votes coming in. All right. Oh, there's a few more. I always give this one an extra second because it'll pause and nobody will answer, and then I'll get about 40 all at the same time. I think everyone takes that second to decide. All right, I'll go ahead and share the results. So it looks like most of you answered non-visible, some answered invisible, and some answered hidden. The correct term is non-visible. And the reason this is important is because when you are working with service members or their dependents or veterans, I do refer to veterans a lot in this presentation, but this also goes for active duty as well. When you refer to someone living with a disability and it's not one that is visible to other people, when you refer to it as invisible, and when we think of invisible, invisible friend, or like invisible, not really there, it's almost like this mindset of it's make believe and it's not really there, or you're making it up or you're exaggerating it, right? And so invisible is not a term. And then the other is hidden. We definitely want to stray away from using the word hidden, the term hidden, because it's not something that we're necessarily trying to hide. It's just a disability that you may not be aware of. Many times I have been asked, unfortunately, I have been asked, what's wrong with you? Or I've been told it doesn't look like anything is wrong with you. And what I state is that I have a non-visible disability. Daisy has a patch on her vest and it's teal with a teal ribbon and it says not.
Oh,
Oh, I lost
looks
y'all
like
for a second.
we lost
Can
Kimberly.
y'all still hear me?
Yes, so the last thing we heard is she has a teal ribbon.
Okay, she has a teal ribbon on her vest. I'm sorry about that. She has a teal ribbon on her vest, and on that vest it says not all disabilities are visible. So it's just important to keep in mind that the disabilities that you may not be able to see or you may not be aware of are considered non-visible disabilities. What are non-visible disabilities? They are disabilities that, again, are not apparent, but they could be chronic illnesses or even cognitive functioning, but they do significantly impair daily living. The stigma around non-visible disabilities, military service members, both active duty and veterans, are assumed to have non-visible disabilities a lot of times because of their combat experiences. But this really isn't the case, right? I think, unfortunately, media and Hollywood has made this perception or this idea or stereotype that veterans are basically, they may look like nothing's wrong with them, but really they're about to explode, or they're at their wits' end, or they're dangerous, or they might attack, or loud noises bother them. No, not all veterans or service members or people in general are like that, are experiencing that. And two, not every veteran or military service member has been to combat. But three, a key point here is that not all PTSD from the military is as a result of going to combat. It could be from other experiences, such as interpersonal violence. So, what are some causes? So, there's a lot of causes like isolation or constant moving, geographic separation. I've it's been awesome watching all the different comments and thoughts and feedback in the chat throughout these 3 days of presentation, because I've been able to see there are some of you that really haven't had a lot of interaction with the military, and we move, we transfer, right, every couple of years, but understanding that separation, just those decisions on, we've got to move in the summertime so the kids can start school in the fall, which means you're going to be separated from your spouse for 6 months. And that may be difficult. And then compound on top of that things that you might have already been going through. There are these stressors that are added and compounded because of being in a military environment and just working in this role. Another is reunification stressors, deployment stressors, identity challenges, and of course, interpersonal violence. I talked about three different things, but I'm going to put them all here on the slide as you see. One is persons living with disabilities. Two is IPV survivors, and three is veterans. Now, the reason I chose to really focus on veterans rather than just active duty service members, even though you may interact with active duty service members, is because more than likely, especially all of you who are in a helping role, whether you work in the military, the DoD, or not, you are most likely going to come across someone who is in the military or someone who's a veteran. And you may not feel that way, or you may not realize it. You don't have to always ask someone if they served in the military. It could be part of your intake form, but there are many veterans and many service members, and they may not always disclose it. So I stick with veteran throughout this presentation, but keep in mind, a lot of this is relevant to active duty as well. So I want to see in the chat box, what's something that you feel these three populations or an individual who can identify with as a person living with disabilities, or an individual who I can identify as a survivor, and an individual who I can identify as a veteran, what do you believe that they have in common? Trauma, PTSD, isolation. I don't know what's going on. It seems every time I open the chat box, it's kicking me out. So I don't know what's happening there. I apologize about that. Y'all should still be able to open and see my slides. Unknown circumstances, that's a good one. Not the unknown. I've never had someone answer that actually that way. Good. Being forgotten, feeling alone, anxiety, difficult finding support systems. Yes. And a person, Carlos said a person can be all three. Someone said embarrassment, no support. Oh, Dr. Ava said, when you're posting, make sure that your little blue box says everyone and not just host and panelist. I think it does default to host and panelist, so I might change it to everyone. But yes, all of these things are things, all of the things that you've listed in the chat box are either situations or feelings or emotions that these three different populations have in common. And as Carlos had mentioned, someone can be all three. And a big piece of that is inclusion. So there is a lot of different barriers and challenges to having inclusion when you're each one of these different categories of population. And we're going to go through those. The first one is people living with disabilities. And keep in mind, again, I like to always throw tips out there. As you see, I didn't say disabled. That's just another more culturally appropriate term is people or persons living with disabilities because we want to be identified as a person before our disabilities. That's person first language. It takes practice, but it's something y'all can work on implementing. So the first one is programmatic. So a person living with disabilities, a barrier that they have to being included or getting through their life and participating in activities is just that, being able to participate, because there may be a programmatic situation or challenge, such as say that there are tables set up a certain way for this event, and they tell you to show up early so you can get to your table because you are a person living with disability who uses a wheelchair. And if you don't get there early, you're not going to be able to get to your table. That could make someone not even want to participate because they don't want to have to go out of their way because you can't spread your tables out a little bit more, right? And so there could be program barriers to being included or participating. And this is also inclusion to getting help as well. For example, attitudinal. And attitudinal, when I say that regarding barriers to inclusion for people living with disabilities, is that there's this mindset of, well, you have plenty of resources out there, or maybe we can't really help you, or we're not really familiar with anxiety. We help with PTSD, but not anxiety, or well, we don't understand that disability, or maybe you need a little bit more help in it from a different program. And there's an attitude of, I'm not sure that we can help you. And if we can help you, are we really helping you? And do they even really need help? That's an attitude, unfortunately, that I've personally come across is, well, it must not be that bad. You have a dog, so you should be fine. The next is social. I live in a very small town in West Texas, and I am known for making sure that activities are inclusive for everyone. And I will be very, clear on like, hey, making sure not everybody can participate. Yes, that's fine. You can have this event or this community activity or this big fundraiser, but you need to make sure that everybody can attend. For example, if you have an environment where it's extremely hot outside and there's no shade, again, living in West Texas, someone's not going to be able to have that social interaction with others because maybe they need that shade. And there's also that social communication of asking, what do you need? So I always recommend if you're putting on your own presentation or if you're communicating with someone you serve, veteran or not, you can always ask, are there any accommodations that you need or that we can provide? And that just helps open up that communication of that social acceptance of that person living with disabilities. Physical. This is what most people recognize when it comes to person living with disabilities. They can't get in there because of their wheelchair, or they have a dog and they can't get in a restaurant, or there's just so many things that it's again goes back to visual. We can see visual things. When I talk about ADA compliance and accessibility, people automatically resort to what's going on with the buildings, or what buildings need fixed, or what in the buildings need fixed. Do the elevators work? It's not just that. These are the other barriers that we're talking about, but physical barriers are one of them. I had an experience locally where they built these incredible accessible restrooms that were perfect. However, there was no sidewalk to them. You had to get to them, you had to go over like some cactus and some dirt and some rough ground. And so I said, these restrooms are great, but how do you expect the person to get to them? And that's another physical barrier. If I can't even use a restroom, I'm probably just not going to go to an event or an activity. Or again, I'm not going to be asking for help. I had a nonprofit who completely changed their doors and everything. They had an overhaul of their building because they realized people weren't coming to get help from them and getting funding and resources from them because there were people living with disabilities that couldn't actually get into their building. So once they removed those, more people were getting help, and it was a huge increase of people living with disabilities that were coming in for help, which is awesome. There are also policies either that people don't understand or policies that aren't clear, or there's just no policy that exists regarding people living with disabilities and what to do and how to do those things. And sometimes, honestly, there's policies put into place that people don't consider people living with disabilities. I'm a huge advocate for that. There is an advocacy movement called About Us Without Us, and it's It's about people living with disabilities and decision makers, government leaders making decisions about people living with disabilities and their needs and their rights and their access without including people living with disabilities in the discussion. And so those policies could possibly now be barriers to inclusion because you're having people make policies that actually aren't familiar with what the needs are. Next is transportation. There are some transportation issues when it comes to people living with disabilities. There are a lot of public transit systems, but when we're talking about veterans, a lot of veterans live in rural areas as well. And if there's no transportation for them and then there's no transportation that's accessible, that could be a problem. There's a lot of events in the bigger city near where I'm at, and they can be after 6, 7, 8 o'clock p.m. at night, but the public transit system ends at 6 p.m. And that's really the only accessible transportation system we have. So that's a barrier to them participating in their community and activities because they have no other way to get to that activity. And last is communication. A lot of times people just don't know how to communicate with people living with disabilities. Unfortunately, I have people that will say hi to Daisy before they say hi to me, or some people don't say hi to me at all sometimes. They say hi to Daisy, which is not appropriate. And sometimes someone is using a wheelchair. They don't know, do I bend over? Do I stand up? Do I grab a seat? How do I talk to this person? You can ask what they're comfortable. Do you mind if I kneel beside you? Do you mind if I pull up a chair beside you? Or just communication in general, right? And not everybody can verbally communicate. Some people are nonverbal. So, how do you communicate with that person? For those of you that don't know, there's an app called Wavelo, Wavelo, but it's a ASL app. And so I can communicate. And just like you see our ASL interpreter here, I can communicate with someone through video chat on the other line on my smartphone. And the ASL interpreter is there interpreting our conversation for someone who is deaf or hard of hearing. Yep, there are functional communication devices. I just helped someone who had a stroke and is not able to communicate, and he's just been living that way for 5 years. But there's actually technology that can help that person communicate. It's just about advocating and finding the help for that person. And yes, I will put that app in the chat during a break because I want to make sure I copy the correct link. So what are some trends in military connected persons with disabilities? So there is a difference between service connected and non-service connected disabilities. So you could be in the military for 10 years, okay? And you hear about people getting their VA disability claim or getting a disability check from the VA, or there are disabilities that happen while you were in service that happen because of your service. For example, I went through a radiation cloud when I was in Japan during the tsunami. That would be a service connected disability if something were to be related to that. Now, the time where I thought I could surf and I could not surf in Hawaii, that would not be service connected because that did not happen because of the military. And so there is a difference between those two different definitions of disabilities. But it's important to recognize that over a third of 30%, excuse me, of veterans report having some sort of service connected disability. And a lot of them are physical injuries, PTSD, and TBI. Here on this chart, you can see that, let's see, I got my little pointer. Okay, here you can see on this chart, you have where it's increasing in years from 1990 to 2018. And as you see with the red line, this red line tells you that this is the number of service connected disabled veterans living with disabilities. This blue line here is just the number of veterans that we have. So the number of veterans we have is decreasing, but more and more are reporting that they have service-connected disabilities. It's important to remember that, again, you're most likely in your line of work, you're going to come across someone who is either active duty or who is a veteran. And this is why this training is so important, so you can understand how to communicate and how to engage with them to best help them. All right, so we talked about person living with disabilities, barriers to inclusion. Now let's talk about veterans, veterans barriers to inclusion. One is adjusting to a new community. A lot of people, we talk about interpersonal violence, and I'm sure you all are familiar and have been trained and had discussions on suicide as well. And we know that there's is a high suicide rates, and a lot of people don't always understand it. Suicide, a big factor of that is identity and being able to adapt and transition into a civilian life, and because you're adjusting to a new community and what it's like, right? That's a barrier to feeling included. And almost always, especially having a service dog, I'm always asked, "Oh, are you in the military?" Which is not thing I'm not proud of. I'm proud of that, but I just want to be Kim. And so, how do I not be that person that stands out in every single crowd in my small town? Next is transportation. You have people coming back to the United States from all over the world who are either active duty or veterans, and they don't have transportation. So they may have sold their car because they were in Germany and they didn't need a car in Germany or Japan or whatever the case may be. But transportation is another barrier. But keep in mind, if you are a veteran and now you're a veteran living with disabilities, I don't know, but to get a personal vehicle outfitted to help with your mobility device, it can be almost 40, 50, 60, 70, $80,000. I know a veteran who wanted to drive his truck and his family did fundraisers, bake sales, so they could afford to get the mechanical arm to be able to get his wheelchair back into the back of his truck and so he could drive again. It is very expensive, and veterans, they don't want to ask for help or they don't want to ask for money. That's a very common mindset. So they might have transportation barriers. Next is transition to civilian life. So how is that different from adjusting to a new community? Is because adjusting to a new community is fitting in, whereas transition to civilian life is, wait, so I'm my own boss? I'm being told I'm not going to be told what to do every day. I don't have a schedule of where to be. Like I don't have to go work out today. Yeah. So there's this transition of what am I supposed to do with my day every day? Kind of something that seems silly is what am I supposed to wear every day? Like I've gone from wearing a uniform to what am I supposed to wear to work every day? And so having that transition, veterans may just step back and say, you know what, never mind. I just don't want to be involved or included. I don't want to go get help. I don't want to experience this. Yes, Raymond said it's leaving a community and trying to fit into a new life. Yes, I've seen veterans be reunited with veterans that they went to combat with and surprised, and they did this like camping retreat, and they didn't know that they were going to be reunited. And they just emotionally, it is so much, and they do so much healing in those 5 or 6 days together than they could do in 3 years of therapy sometimes. It's incredible. And because of that community that they have. And so when you're leaving that, it's very difficult. Next is that unique attitudinal. So again, that mindset that veterans are all about to explode. We've gone through so much and we've all deployed and we've all shot somebody or been shot at or we've moved a lot. There's so many different that unique attitude that sometimes people have towards veterans is really a problem. And then military focused mental health, a big reason why you're here is making sure that people understand, civilian agencies as well understand how our brains are wired essentially. You have to remember our brains aren't even done developing till we're 26, 27 years old. You have people joining the military at 17 and they could have deployed 5 or 6 times to Iraq or Afghanistan or anywhere else in the world during that time. And so that's just a tiny piece of it. But then you're looking at how is mental health handled in the military? How is it talked about in the military? Now you have someone coming to the civilian life or coming to you and your agency, a civilian agency for help. They're trying to get military focused mental health because they're trying to communicate with you, but maybe you don't understand the military environment. But it's very important to have this training and this understanding so you can better serve them. Here's a perspective of why this is important. If you see this chart here, you can see that veterans who have a 70% or higher, which it's government math of how you get 70%, we're not going to get into how they do that. You could have 100% on 6 different disabilities and still be 40% disabled according to the VA. It's a process that they do. But either way, if a veteran is 70% or higher on their disability rating, it says the employment rate for them is 25%, whereas someone with no service-connected disability, their employment rate is 72%. So now we're talking about all the different barriers of inclusion as a veteran, and now someone who's a veteran living with disabilities, it even increases the more of the barriers and challenges they have to living a quality life, which is could be why they're coming to you. If you're an agency that helps with utilities or rent or homelessness, this could be a reason why they're coming to you, is because they cannot find employment or they cannot find stable housing. What about military connected IPV survivors? Military connected interpersonal violence survivors, this is a couple different charts, and I'll leave them up here for a moment. But I know you've heard a lot of the statistics, right? There are service members and veterans who have experienced interpersonal violence or sexual assault, both men and women. Um, it ranges in the service branches. There are different historical trends, and we don't necessarily get into those, but it's just important to recognize that in the general population of women, um, if you were to look at this chart for women that have recently deployed or not been deployed, the rates are generally higher, all for sexual violence, psychological aggression, and severe physical violence. Again, it's almost like deployment adds another stressor and a risk factor for violence, which is something you experience in the military is deployment. This chart here, I'm going to move this thing. This chart here is a chart that I created to show the difference between what are PTSD symptoms, what are interpersonal violence tactics, and what is TBI symptoms. And this is important because if you look at physical, for example, a physical symptom of PTSD is nightmare aggression or aggression during a flashback. Now, if someone were to use that or perpetrate that on somebody else and say it's because I had a flashback, but they're doing it outside of their nightmares, they're just perpetrating violence outside of those PTSD symptoms, that's interpersonal violence. And then there's TBI. Some of the physical symptoms of TBI include headache, visual problems, and seizures. If you look at the PTSD symptoms on a behavioral standpoint, we see self-isolation, avoiding social environments, sticking to yourself, and again, that transition into civilian life, into that new community. With PTSD, it's very hard for others to understand. Again, I'm a woman living in West Texas, a very small town with a service dog, and having that alone and not knowing the rest of my story is very difficult. I do experience a lot of doubt from others of if she's a real service dog. And so that has led to me having some self-isolation because of that experience. Whereas an IPV tactic we know is social isolation. Now for TBI, a behavioral symptom may be agitation or acting on impulse or even sleep disturbances. What this chart, and we're not going to go through all of them, but what this chart is here for is to show that there is a difference between PTSD symptoms, IPV tactics, and TBI. I think again, Hollywood, just society in general, does cross the lines or have a lot of gray areas and saying, oh, this veteran abused this person because they have PTSD. That's a very big statement. That really needs to be broken down. Is that person perpetrating violence as intimate partner or interpersonal violence, or are they experiencing PTSD symptoms? And so these things are things to keep in mind because we're going to transition into being a survivor of interpersonal violence. So the first barrier to inclusion with IPV survivors is myths. Can anybody put in the chat box what is a myth when it comes to survivors of violence? What's a myth that you hear, or maybe one of those statements that kind of makes you roll your eyes? No, that's not true. Can anyone think of any of those? A myth about interpersonal violence survivors. Just making it up. They must like it. They're weak. It's their fault. They could have just left. Yes. They're faking. Yep. If they wanted to leave, they would have done it already. They always play victim. Oh, it wasn't that bad. Minimization. Yes. Minimization is huge. Toughen up. Yes, all of those things we know are myths of IPV. So thank you for sharing all those and thank you for participating. And lying, yes, there is that still that problem of the myth of, well, most of them are actually false reports. No, they're not false reports, But because of that myth, it's really created that toxic mindset, right? So survivors, as we know, are afraid to come forward for many reasons. But they're even more so afraid if a survivor doesn't come forward and get help, but now they're adjusting to their new life, surrounded by a society where they believe in these myths and they feel that they're not going to be believed about what actually happened to them. As we know what kind of life that might be for that person and how difficult it might be for that person to engage in a quality life. Next is minimization. Survivors definitely minimize, which some of you already mentioned in the chat. Survivors, their families, the offenders, society in general, they minimize what happened to them. It wasn't that bad. At least I'm alive, or it's not like I had this happen to me. Could have been worse. They immediately start minimizing what happened to them and discrediting their feelings and their emotions, and they're not validating themselves and their worth. Another is priorities. Their priorities of the society, when I say society's priorities aren't always there for violent survivors. And we know this, right? I think that there's been great change both on the civilian sector and in the DoD of making survivors a priority and making their needs a priority. But we know that where a survivor may go to law enforcement, or if a survivor trying to get through trial, sometimes it's almost like they're put at the bottom of the stack. And because helping survivors of violence is not always a priority, they feel even more isolated, withdrawn. They need to minimize what happened to them. They're not important. Again, all these different challenges that they may experience. And then, of course, we know there's victim blaming. A day in the life. This is me with Daisy. You can see her little patch there on her vest. I didn't realize that. So you can see her little patch on her vest. This is my service dog, Daisy. If you can see it as well, she's holding my hand. That's one of the things that she's trained to do. We are sitting there at our first Veterans Day parade. And this was a lot for me, really, because it was the first time I was a veteran and actually recognized I was a veteran. She was able to pick up on that. And you can't see in the picture, but the car right in front of us is actually the sailors of the detachment that I just separated from. And watching them march in uniform, it was a lot to process and a lot to take in. And with that being said, I can share. Let me see the time. What time am I at? 3:05. Okay, I got some time. So I'll share when it comes to a person who is a veteran and a person who's living with disabilities and a survivor. And Jeanette said crowd and noise would have sent me. Yeah, actually, that's a good point. Thank you for bringing that up. I will say that I get asked some silly questions. So y'all might want to buckle up for some of these things I'm about to tell you. But I do get that assumption a lot that crowds bother me and noise bothers me. And it's not necessarily the crowds that bother me. It's more of it being just disorganized chaos and nobody knowing where they're going, and there not being structure or organization, or people being frustrated because it's an unorganized event or activity, or there's no clear guidance or direction. Because of that, I can feel everyone else's frustration, and that can be frustrating for me. So it's not necessarily that there's all these people around me. It's more of what kind of environment am I in with all those people. I do get asked a lot. First question I get asked is, were you in the military? Which most people know me, but for those that don't, they say, oh, were you in the military? And I say, yes, I was in the Navy for 10 years. And the second question I always get asked is, were you in combat? And I say, yes, I was in combat. I deployed to Japan as a little baby 19-year-old, and I was there on land during the tsunami and did not realize how bad it was until the next day when I have 200 Facebook comments and likes and messages asking, are you okay? Are you alive? And we had no idea how bad it was. And so we that was not a combat experience. We did do a lot of recovery for the next couple of weeks. And like I said, we did go through a couple radiation clouds. But my other two deployments were combat. One was to the Red Sea, fighting pirates essentially, and one was to the Gulf, fighting ISIS. And that last deployment was 10 months long. And so I tell people, like, yes, I've been to combat. However, and as an advocate, and sometimes it's exhausting, but as an advocate, I always say, however, not all the reasons I have Daisy is because of my combat experience. And I can tell it really takes people back sometimes because it is that automatic assumption, oh, you were in combat. And then being a female, I've been asked, I thought they didn't let women in combat. Now they do, one, and they, well, they have let women in combat for a while, but they do let women be certain like rangers and other more well-known combat roles. But two, I do get questions, and I don't even have to answer these questions, but I do it to ask, I do answer these questions. So hopefully nobody else will. Nobody else will have to answer these questions. And I've been asked, does it look like you need help? Or why do you need a service dog? I have three kids, and two of them I adopted, my nieces that I adopted. I have my master's, I have my license in social work, I own my own business. I'm on this awesome team at Nova. For a while, I was a single parent, but I'm recently married, and I have all these things in my life. And I have had people ask me, how can you adopt kids if you need a service dog? And how can you own your own business, or how can you win that award if you need a service dog? And some of those questions that I get are very, I think people really don't understand, but I think part of them is just doubt and that mindset of not really getting what it is like to be a female or a veteran or a person living with disabilities and someone who uses a mental health service dog. It's also hard because people with service, and again, this is just my experience with service dogs. Every experience is different. But what Daisy helps me with, a lot of people don't see. Um, for in the last story I'll give as an example, I spoke at my city council quite often about accessibility and ADA rights. And the first time I did it, and every time since then, but the first time I did it, I had a lot of supporters there in the audience, and the city council sits up above you and looking down on you, which is very hard. And I'm a little uncomfortable. I don't mind public speaking, but when you have these decision makers and you're basically telling them you're breaking federal civil rights law, so it's not something they really want to hear, but they're looking down on you, it's very uncomfortable. And you're advocating and trying to give them solutions to these problems. Daisy was sitting beside me, leaning against me, but she was facing the audience behind me. And I had a couple friends say she looked like she was about to pounce. And I'm like, no, she like she's not aggressive at all. But they said she just was staring all of us down. And I'm like, good, she's doing her job. But they had never seen that before. They had not seen, they always see her sitting on my feet or staying beside me and doing what she's supposed to, but they hadn't seen her respond, if that makes sense. She doesn't go to the door and unlock the door for me. She doesn't get my medicine or my cell phone. She doesn't do those things because I don't need her to do those things. So it can be very hard. So when you have a veteran who's possibly a person with disabilities and a survivor coming in, and you ask them, are you in combat or a combat veteran? And that's your only justification for why they might have PTSD. As an advocate and as someone who's supposed to be helping them, whether you're a government or civilian agency, you've already shut down some of that trust and that communication before it even got opened. Because no, I don't just have a service dog because of my combat. I don't just have, I'm not just experiencing depression or suicidal thoughts because of combat. I've never been to combat, so I guess I don't need help. So it's very important to keep this open mindset. I saw Rosie said that you don't answer them. There are times I don't answer. I get asked if she sleeps. The first time I said, yeah, I didn't understand. And then they said, how does she help you? And I was like, oh, I think the person was just not being very nice. So the second time someone asked me if she sleeps, I said, nope, I just plug her into her USB port and we go on about our day. And they looked at me like I was the crazy one. All right. So, what are some best practices? So, things to keep in mind. You got to keep it fun sometimes because I'm telling you, I've got some pretty interesting stories that just have left people speechless. Yeah, we've had some interesting times, me and Daisy. All right. So, best practices. So, engaging with military IPV survivors living with disabilities. Use person first language. This is hard for a lot of people, not because they don't care. I think because it's just in front of us, right? When you see those blue signs, what does the sign say? It says handicap parking. Well, appropriate should be accessible parking or a person living with disabilities. Handicap, there's a history behind that. And it's essentially people living with disabilities can't do anything. So they hold out their hats and they want a handout. That's where the term handicap came from. And so we use the term accessible. So just practice saying that, oh, that's accessible parking, or that's an accessible sticker, right? Just being able to practice that and saying, oh, you're disabled. No, you're a person living with a disability. Does that make sense? It takes practice. It does take practice. I'll say that. Cultural competency, it's so important to understand the military culture. And I will tell you, unless you've been in the military, it's hard to really get it, right? You can do enough of these presentations and you can communicate with enough of us and just listen. And we can help you understand our culture. We can help you understand how it is a different world, why, if you're a civilian agency, why we're coming to you and why we're not going to maybe a DoD resource. Yes, it might be a great resource. They might have revamped it and it's doing awesome, but there's a reason we may not be using that resource. Look around your buildings. How are service members and veterans depicted? I actually had someone message me about this. I did this presentation and they emailed me a few days later and sent me a picture of this crumpled up poster. They had crumpled up 3 or 4 posters they had hanging in their office. And it says, "We help veterans." And the veteran is in this dark room in the corner off to the side. One of them is of a veteran and he has like pills in his hand. And I can't remember what the third one looked like, but that's how veterans were being displayed in their, or service members, because one was in uniform, but that's how they were being displayed in their office. And they realized, like, wow, we're just creating this mindset that this is what all veterans are like, or this is just how they are. So they took those posters down. They were really proud of themselves. I was proud of them too. So just look around your office and your space. How are not just veterans, but how are persons living with disabilities, or how are the survivors, excuse me, how are survivors depicted? I saw someone in the chat, Madeline said, military culture training can be found at Psych Armor. Yes, Psych Armor is a great organization. I love Dr. Athrall and what she's developed. You could check them out, but they have some good military kind of 101 training as well. So understanding different things about military culture. It's important to ask the person if they served in the military during intake. If you do have intake forms, you can put, have you served in the military? And if you ask, were you in combat? Say, you can ask that question, but I also recommend maybe considering adding the question, did you experience any other traumatic experience? Or do you have other traumatic experiences related to military? Because asking that question, a lot of people, again, ask, were you in the military and were you in combat? It immediately shuts down the conversation of someone having or needing, someone having trauma or a negative experience, or someone needing help because they weren't in combat, or maybe they were, but their combat wasn't that bad. My third deployment was 10 months, but I had a blast and I did some awesome, cool stuff. Next is, as I said here, don't ask if they served in combat unless you ask other causes of non-visible disabilities. So that same question, are there other traumatic experience or other experiences of related to your combat of why you might be coming in for services today? You can always ask the person if they'd like to talk about military service. I know that Dr. Ava Ramirez talked about this in the beginning on the first day. What Ask them if they want to talk about their military service. I don't always want to be known as Kim, the one with the dog, or Kim, the one with the service dog, or that lady with the dog, or that Navy person with the dog. Sometimes I just want to be known as Kim. Okay. When people say thank you for your service, we've had that discussion. Everyone has their own response, and that's fine. But not everybody wants to talk about their military service all the time. And so just keep that in mind. Are you comfortable talking about it? No? Okay, move on. This is very important. These are 2 questions you can ask someone with a service dog. Is a service dog a service animal required because of a disability? And what work or task has the dog been trained to perform? So these are very important, whether you're an agency, a restaurant, you can actually ask someone to leave. And that's a whole process I can explain later. But you can actually ask someone if it's a service dog. Why is this important? Because survivors, veterans, people living with disabilities, we use service dogs for a reason. And for those that are not using them for the right reasons and they're not really service dogs, you're actually making it a lot harder for us. I will say that Daisy and I have actually been attacked a few times by other dogs that have been wearing a service dog vest. It's not been fun. Usually it's in Walmart. They're chasing us down the aisle when the little ones that jump out of the cart. Ask everyone that you interact with in your agency if they need accommodations when they first arrive. Or again, if you're doing a presentation, are there any accommodations we can help you with or we can provide? And then review, update, and establish and strengthen any MOUs you have with the military installations near you. To keep this in mind, keep in mind that there are reasons why not everybody uses the military programs. And maybe they already have. There may be reasons why they're coming to you as a civilian agency. Review your MOUs and take that into consideration. This here is a chart. You can screenshot it or save it, but I think you'll have access to the slides. But you can tell it talks, this is your a good start to person first language. So you say person with a disability, not disabled or handicapped. Person with cerebral palsy, not cerebral palsy victim. Does that make sense? So it just helps show you how not to use language that could perpetrate stereotypes or harmful thoughts and processes. Let's go to our, and this slide, I put this in here intentionally with the source down here. This is here, you could print this out and put it around your offices, whether you're DOD or civilian. It does take practice. I will say there are times I've done it once already in this presentation where you will slip and say handicap, or you may slip and say disabled. It's, we're not perfect, right? But it is something that you can practice. But you're putting the person first. You're saying, I'm Kim and I'm living with PTSD, not Kim has PTSD, or well, she's got PTSD, right? It's not like I'm carrying it around and it's a joy. It's definitely not a benefit. It's not a privilege to have. It's just important to keep that kind of those thoughts in mind, right? That when you stop dissing disabilities, all that's left is your abilities.